Ethan Carter had always believed in earning his peace. A decorated military veteran, now serving as a diligent city official, he'd earned his quiet suburban retreat through long years of sacrifice and perseverance. Every detail of his home, a modest two-story house with a neatly trimmed lawn and a workshop tucked behind, reflected his pride in hard work. In the evenings, Ethan would be found under the warm glow of his porch lights, a well-worn copy of his favorite historical novels in hand, or meticulously restoring classic cars that parked proudly in his garage. His home was not merely a shelter. It was his sanctuary and a symbol of his independence. But tranquility in his neighborhood was about to be shattered. Karen Wilcox, the self-appointed queen of the local homeowners association HOA, had always regarded herself as the guardian of community aesthetics and order. With her sharp tongue and an unyielding sense of entitlement, she and her cadre of board members viewed every deviation from their strict standards as a personal affront. Karen's reign of micromanagement had turned pleasant neighbors into cautious onlookers, each silently praying not to attract her scorn. One bright Saturday morning, while Ethan was fine-tuning the engine of a vintage '57 Chevy in his driveway, a sleek black sedan pulled up along the curb. Out stepped Karen, clad in a crisp blazer and pearls, a walking emblem of authority in her own eyes. Her eyes narrowed as they landed on Ethan's property. "Mr. Carter," she called, her tone as sweet as it was menacing. "I need to have a word about your porch lights." Ethan, wiping grease from his hands, frowned. "My porch lights," he repeated, stepping forward with measured calm. "I've had them for years. They're simple enough to guide me home and ensure my security." Karen's smile was thin and controlled. "They're far too bright. They disturb the neighborhood ambience, and frankly, they're a blatant disregard for our community standards. You're jeopardizing the aesthetic harmony we all strive for." Her words fell like gavel strikes in a courtroom where Ethan was already on trial for being different. As neighbors peered through curtains and behind hedges, Ethan's irritation began to simmer. "I respect the community," he said evenly, "but I also have a right to secure my home and enjoy its comforts. I don't see how my lights, designed for both safety and functionality, violate any rule that was ever democratically agreed upon." Karen's eyes flashed with indignation. "The board voted on these guidelines, and you're out of line if you ignore them. I'm issuing you a final warning. Comply or face consequences." Her voice carried a venom that brooked no argument. Even as she handed him a crisp notice printed in bold letters, the tension was palpable, a harbinger of the storm to come. The encounter left Ethan with a disquieting taste. It wasn't just about a few extra lumens shining in the night. It was about control, a small-scale tyranny imposed by an individual who believed that the HOA's rules were sacred, regardless of their fairness or legality. That evening, as the neon lights of his home cast long shadows on the lawn, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was amiss. The community he'd once trusted was now being policed by a woman who relished every opportunity to assert dominance. In the following days, Ethan began to notice subtle changes. A neighbor mentioned an unusual meeting of the board, and whispers spread about Karen's growing influence and the escalating fines levied on minor infractions. But nothing prepared him for the audacity of the HOA's next move. Even as he tried to shrug off the incident as an isolated case of overzealous management, a sense of impending conflict loomed like a gathering storm on the horizon. Standing on his porch one early evening, Ethan reflected on the principles that had carried him through the darkest days of his military service. His duty was not only to himself, but to his community, one that deserved fairness and justice. With resolve hardening in his chest, he silently vowed that he would not be bullied into conformity. Tonight, as the warm light of his home met the chill of an overbearing rule, Ethan Carter's peaceful life was about to be disrupted, and he would soon be forced to fight back. The following morning, Ethan awoke to a sense of déjà vu. Only this time, it was not just the memory of Karen's biting words that greeted him, but a freshly printed envelope pinned to his door. Inside lay a $750 fine for violating community light regulations. The fine was presented with an air of finality, as though it were not a suggestion, but an edict. Ethan's heart pounded as he read the notice. $750? For a couple of porch lights? He murmured incredulously. Immediately, he recalled the conversation with Karen, her voice dripping with self-righteous indignation. As he scanned the document, it became clear that the fine was only the beginning of an orchestrated effort to force him into submission. Just as Ethan was about to retreat to his workshop to assess his next steps, he heard a familiar, patronizing laugh from the sidewalk. Karen had returned, leaning casually against her black sedan, as if the fine were an everyday inconvenience. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she purred, crossing her arms in that trademark manner. "I trust you've read the notice. The rules are the rules, after all." Ethan squared his shoulders. "I have read it, Karen, but I'm a city official, and I know there's nothing in our local ordinances that justifies such a fine. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the zoning office. This is nothing more than a power play." His tone was calm, yet laced with a quiet defiance that made it clear he was not intimidated. Karen's smile wavered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Oh, Ethan, you're always so certain of your authority. But remember, here in our community, the board's decisions take precedence. I suggest you think twice before challenging them." Her words were a thinly veiled threat, meant to remind him that she held all the cards in this so-called community. Later that day, as Ethan sat in his modest home office with piles of municipal codes and zoning regulations spread out before him, he realized that Karen's fine was based more on arbitrary whim than on any legal foundation. Determined to stand his ground, he drafted a letter of complaint, meticulously citing local laws and precedents that reinforced his right to maintain his home as he saw fit. His fingers moved decisively over the keyboard, each keystroke an act of rebellion against an overreaching authority. Across town, the wheels of Karen's operation were already in motion. Within hours of Ethan's defiant letter, word spread among several residents that inspectors would be visiting their homes. Rumors swirled that anonymous complaints had been submitted, complaints that painted Ethan as a renegade who threatened the community's cherished order. Before long, a pair of stern-faced inspectors arrived at his door, clipboards in hand, determined to root out any perceived infraction. Ethan greeted them with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through far worse challenges. "Good morning," he said politely, inviting them into his home. "I understand there are concerns regarding my property." His tone was respectful, but edged with the unmistakable firmness of someone who knew his rights. One inspector, a middle-aged man with a furrowed brow, replied, "We've received reports about your porch lights, Mr. Carter. They're reportedly too bright for the neighborhood standards." Ethan's eyes sparkled with a mixture of amusement and frustration. "I assure you, the lights are simply a matter of practicality and personal safety. I'd be happy to show you the relevant codes that support my position." He gestured toward the neatly arranged documents on his desk, every page a testament to municipal fairness. Outside, Karen watched the scene unfold from a distance, her arms wrapped around herself like a fortress. To her, this was exactly what she had envisioned, a defiant homeowner clashing with the order she so ruthlessly sought to enforce. In her mind, Ethan's reliance on legal technicalities was an affront to the very spirit of community, and she would not tolerate such insubordination. As the inspectors left with more questions than answers, Ethan felt the weight of the situation settle over him. The fine, the inspectors, and Karen's relentless presence were all part of a calculated strategy designed to intimidate. But rather than retreating in fear, Ethan's resolve only hardened. He knew that by standing up for his rights, he was also defending the broader principles of fairness and freedom that underpinned his community. That night, as he reviewed the day's events with a mix of cautious optimism and steely determination, Ethan realized that the HOA's first power move was merely the opening salvo in a battle for control, a battle that would soon escalate far beyond a mere dispute over porch lights. In the weeks that followed, the pressure on Ethan intensified as Karen and her cohorts embarked on a series of increasingly audacious maneuvers. It began subtly, a whispered rumor here, an anonymous letter there, until it was clear that Karen's tactics were designed to corner him into submission. Neighbors who had once exchanged friendly hellos now eyed him warily, uncertain whether to support his quiet resistance or bow to the authority of the HOA. Late one rainy evening, as Ethan sat reviewing municipal ordinances in his study, a knock at the door startled him. Standing on his doorstep was a nervous-looking man in a poorly pressed suit, clutching a thick folder. "Mr. Carter?" the stranger asked tentatively. "I represent one of the board members. There are some discrepancies regarding your property. We need to inspect your backyard and perhaps other areas as well." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Discrepancies? I'm not aware of any issues," he replied calmly. Yet, as the man continued, Ethan's suspicions deepened. The board member's tone was rehearsed, a blend of condescension and feigned concern, as he listed vague violations that seemed invented on the spot. "It appears your property might be inadvertently interfering with community standards," the man explained, his eyes darting around as if fearful of repercussions. "We'll need to document everything." Determined to uncover the root of these charges, Ethan began his own investigation. Late into the night, he scoured minutes from previous board meetings, studied the bylaws, and even discreetly recorded snippets of conversations with other homeowners. The more he dug, the clearer it became. Karen was systematically exploiting loopholes and fabricating infractions to justify her ever-tightening grip on the neighborhood. Even more damning were whispered confessions from board members, one of whom privately admitted, "Karen's fines vanish into her own pockets. We're just her puppets." Armed with mounting evidence, Ethan set up discreet cameras around his property. What began as a precaution soon turned into a full-blown operation, capturing every interaction between Karen and her underlings. He documented suspicious late-night meetings, secretive exchanges of envelopes, and even a heated conversation in which one board member muttered, "She's overstepping again. This is pure extortion." Each revelation was meticulously logged, each incident recorded with a precision born of both civic duty and personal defiance. As the days passed, Karen's actions grew bolder and more brazenly illegal. In one instance, a notice was posted on every door in the community, claiming that any homeowner found in violation of newly amended regulations would face immediate eviction. The language was deliberately vague, leaving everyone in a state of anxious uncertainty. Karen held a town hall meeting where she announced, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, that the HOA had the power to seize property if necessary. "We are the guardians of this community," she declared, her voice rising to a crescendo, as if proclaiming a new era of order. "There will be no exceptions." At the meeting, Ethan raised his hand. "With all due respect," he said steadily, "the laws of this city do not grant you, or the board, the power to confiscate private property without due process. What you're doing is not protecting our neighborhood. It's pure tyranny." His words were met with a chorus of uneasy murmurs. For a moment, it seemed as though the board members might side with him, but Karen's steely glare quickly silenced any dissent. "Silence," she snapped. "We have rules for a reason." That very night, as thunder rumbled outside, Ethan reviewed the latest batch of video evidence. Every grain of data, every hushed conversation caught on camera, painted a damning picture of abuse of power and corruption. It was not just a personal battle anymore. It was a struggle for the soul of the neighborhood. Determined to expose the truth, Ethan began compiling his evidence into a dossier that he would soon present to local authorities and the community at large. But the HOA was not done yet. In a desperate move to discredit him, Karen orchestrated a smear campaign that painted Ethan as a criminal, a man who disregarded community values in favor of personal gain. Anonymous flyers circulated with doctored images and false allegations, and social media buzzed with unfounded rumors about his past. It was a calculated effort to isolate him, to convince even the most skeptical neighbors that he was a threat to their idyllic way of life. Yet even as the pressure mounted and the stakes grew higher, Ethan remained resolute. He understood that exposing the truth would be a long and arduous journey, a battle against not just Karen's overzealous ambition, but also the deep-seated fear of a community unaccustomed to questioning authority. Every piece of evidence he gathered was a step toward dismantling the unjust empire that Karen had built. And with each passing day, As more board members began whispering their doubts, the foundation of her tyranny began to tremble. The tipping point came on a cold, gray morning when Ethan awoke to a scene straight out of a nightmare. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed that his driveway was cordoned off by large, conspicuous barricades. A row of tow trucks and utility vans was parked along the street, and workers in high-visibility vests busied themselves with what appeared to be the excavation of his property. At first, Ethan assumed it was a routine repair or a scheduled upgrade, but a hastily posted notice on his front door dispelled that hope. Emergency redevelopment, community improvement initiative. Fury surged through him as he stormed outside. There on the street stood Karen, her arms outstretched as if presenting a grand design. "Your property is in violation," she announced loudly, addressing a small crowd of onlookers who had gathered. "The HOA has determined that your non-compliant property is hindering our vision for a modern, uniform community. Effective immediately, we are taking action to remedy this situation." Ethan's voice rang out, steady and defiant. "You have no right to do this. I've never agreed to these arbitrary rules, and my property is my home, not some test subject for your experiments." His words, echoing off the nearby houses, drew a mixture of gasps and murmurs from the gathering residents. The situation escalated rapidly. As the workers continued their disruptive work, Ethan pulled out a thick folder of legal documents, the very dossier he had spent weeks preparing. At the next HOA meeting, he marched into the community hall with a determined stride and laid out his case. "I have proof," he declared, opening his file for all to see. "Proof that the fines, the inspections, and even this so-called redevelopment are nothing more than a sham to cover up the corruption that plagues this board." The room fell into a heavy silence as neighbors exchanged shocked glances. One by one, doubts began to surface. A board member, his voice trembling, confessed quietly to another homeowner that he'd never truly believed in Karen's draconian measures. "We were told to follow orders," he admitted under his breath. "But I've seen the way she handles things. It's all about control, not community improvement." As Ethan presented irrefutable evidence, video recordings, copies of memos, and even statements from anonymous board insiders, the atmosphere shifted. The once unquestioning obedience of the HOA members started to crumble. In a climactic moment, Ethan challenged Karen publicly. "Show us the authority that gives you the power to tow my car, dig up my driveway, and shut off my utilities without a fair trial. The law stands with me, and the community deserves transparency." Karen's eyes flared with anger, but she maintained a rigid composure. "You're playing with fire, Mr. Carter," she hissed. "If you think you can defy the board's decisions, then you're mistaken. I have inspectors coming, and legal action will be taken against anyone who disrupts the order of this neighborhood." But it was too late. The tide had turned. Neighbors, emboldened by Ethan's courage and the damning evidence he'd amassed, began to voice their own grievances. A respected elderly resident stood up, recalling how her own modest garden had been targeted for an ill-conceived community beautification project. "This isn't about rules," she said softly, her voice quivering with emotion. "It's about power, and we're tired of living in fear." As the meeting reached its crescendo, Ethan unveiled one final piece of evidence, a series of clandestine recordings in which Karen admitted, in a moment of reckless confidence, that the HOA funds were being diverted for her personal luxuries. The room erupted in a mixture of outrage and disbelief. For the first time, even some of Karen's staunch supporters began to question her leadership. Outside the meeting hall, the energy was palpable. A small group of neighbors gathered around Ethan, discussing plans for legal action and community petitions. They spoke of organizing neighborhood watch groups, holding more frequent meetings, and even taking the matter to the local press. In that moment, Ethan wasn't just defending his home. He was igniting a grassroots movement against tyranny. Karen retreated to the back of the hall, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. She realized that her calculated overreach had sparked a fire that could not be easily extinguished. As the community rallied behind Ethan, the once dominant figure of the HOA began to tremble under the weight of her own ambition. That night, as Ethan locked up his home, the dark silhouette of barricades still looming in the distance, he understood that the battle was no longer just about his porch lights or his driveway. It was about restoring justice, reclaiming community voice, and proving that no single person had the right to impose their will on an entire neighborhood. The next chapter in this bitter saga unfolded on a chilly evening that seemed to mirror the coldness in Karen's heart. Determined to reclaim control and force Ethan into submission once and for all, Karen devised what she believed would be her ultimate power play, a desperate, final move that would cement her authority in the eyes of the board and the community. It began with a calculated escalation. One evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, Karen picked up her phone and dialed the local police. In a rehearsed yet urgent tone, she reported that Ethan's porch lights were not just a minor nuisance, but a public disturbance that endangered the safety and tranquility of the community. Her words carried an air of false alarm, designed to trigger an immediate response from law enforcement. Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers arrived at Ethan's home. The doorbell rang, and opening it, Ethan was met by their stern expressions. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said politely, though he could sense the tension in the air. "How can I help you?" One of the officers, eyeing the bright porch lights suspiciously, stated, "We've received complaints about a public disturbance at this address. We need to verify that everything is in order." Ethan calmly produced his city official badge and a copy of a local ordinance, explaining that his lighting was entirely legal and meant for security. The officers, their brows furrowed with mixed confusion and irritation, listened as Ethan outlined the facts. When the second officer added, "It seems this call was made in error," the tension dissipated, at least for the moment. But Karen's determination did not waver. Instead of accepting the dismissal of her false claim, she escalated her tactics further. Late that same night, Ethan's security cameras, those very devices he had installed to protect his home and gather evidence of the HOA's corruption, captured an unmistakable intrusion. In the dim glow of the living room, Ethan watched in disbelief as a shadowy figure crept across his garage. Reviewing the footage frame by frame, he soon identified the intruder as a hired private investigator, secretly employed by Karen to dig up any dirt on him. The investigator's furtive movements and the whispered calls on his cell phone were all recorded, leaving no doubt of illegal surveillance. Fueled by a mix of indignation and resolve, Ethan wasted no time in gathering the incriminating footage. The next HOA meeting, which had become a battleground of ideals and power, would serve as the stage for Karen's undoing. With the community in attendance and tensions running high, Ethan set up his laptop in the meeting room. The screen flickered to life, displaying the grainy yet unmistakable images of the investigator skulking around his property, followed by audio capturing Karen's whispered instructions to him. "Look at this," Ethan announced, his voice resonating with controlled anger as he addressed the assembled crowd. "This is evidence of illegal surveillance and trespassing on my property. Actions orchestrated by the very person who claims to protect our community." A collective gasp rippled through the room. For a few agonizing moments, Karen's face drained of color as the undeniable truth was laid bare for everyone to see. The evidence was irrefutable. Karen's plan, which had started as a desperate attempt to discredit Ethan, had backfired spectacularly. The officers who had once dismissed her call now found themselves questioning the legitimacy of her claims, and even a few board members began to murmur their support for Ethan's right to privacy and security. "This is abuse of power," one longtime resident declared. "We've all been misled." In a final act of desperation, Karen attempted to shift blame by accusing Ethan of inciting unrest and stirring up discord within the community. "He's trying to turn neighbors against one another," she cried, her voice cracking with a mixture of anger and fear. But her words fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. The room buzzed with indignation, and murmurs of support for Ethan filled the space. Realizing that her position was crumbling, Karen's final gambit came in the form of a threat. "If you continue this charade," she warned, eyes darting around the room as if seeking an ally in a sea of dissent, "I will have no choice but to escalate matters legally. And believe me, I won't hesitate to call the police again." Her threat, however, only served to highlight the irrationality and desperation of her actions. That night, as Ethan packed away his recording equipment and secured his home with renewed vigilance, he reflected on the day's events. Karen's desperate measures had not only exposed her own misdeeds, they had also ignited a spark among his neighbors. The community was no longer the silent, subservient group Karen had hoped to control. Instead, they had awakened to the truth, and their collective voice promised that justice was on its way. The morning after the explosive HOA meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood was electric with change. Rumors of Karen's misdeeds and the damning evidence Ethan had presented had spread like wildfire. Neighbors, once too timid to speak up, now gathered in animated clusters on front lawns and at local coffee shops. The community, united in their disillusionment with the tyrannical board, had reached its breaking point. In an unprecedented act of solidarity, a coalition of homeowners formed a grassroots committee to challenge the HOA's authority. The committee, led by a well-respected retired schoolteacher and a local entrepreneur, organized an emergency vote to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. Ballots were cast in record numbers, and the result was a resounding rejection of her leadership. "Karen, you've abused your power for the last time," the chairperson declared during the vote-counting meeting. "We trust in a community that values fairness over authoritarianism." As the vote was tallied and the final count confirmed her ouster, Karen's previously unassailable position crumbled before her eyes. Within hours, news of her removal spread beyond the confines of the neighborhood. Local newspapers picked up the story, and soon city officials announced an investigation into the HOA's practices. The very rules and fines that had been wielded as weapons against Ethan and his neighbors were declared null and void by a critical review of the board's conduct. Karen's personal assets were scrutinized as well. It wasn't long before investigators uncovered a trail of misappropriated funds and questionable transactions. The HOA's finances, once shrouded in secrecy, were now laid bare for public examination. In a dramatic turn of events, Karen was forced to resign and put her own home on the market. "It appears that the house you once ruled from has become a liability," one investigator remarked dryly, as news cameras captured Karen's haggard expression. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. Though he had faced down intimidation and corruption, the cost had been high, not just for him, but for a community that had endured years of needless strife. Yet as he sat on his familiar porch that evening, bathed in the soft glow of his reclaimed lights, he couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. His home, once a target of arbitrary rules and invasive inspections, now stood as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Neighbors began to rebuild the community in new ways. Regular meetings, open forums, and collaborative projects replaced the oppressive regime of the old HOA. The once feared board was disbanded, and a new democratically elected committee was formed, one that prioritized transparency, accountability, and the well-being of every homeowner. Karen's downfall was not merely a professional defeat, it was a personal collapse. As her property was listed for sale and her reputation lay in tatters, she became a cautionary tale, a vivid reminder that no one was above the law. The community's collective triumph was encapsulated in small acts of everyday justice: a neighbor mending a broken fence together, a group organizing a neighborhood watch, and many evenings spent in conversation about what it meant to reclaim their space. In the final analysis, the crumbling of the HOA under Karen's despotic rule marked the beginning of a new era, a time when community values reigned over bureaucratic overreach, and when the voice of the many triumphed over the tyranny of the few. Ethan, with his steadfast courage and unwavering commitment to truth, had ignited that change. And as the sun set over a neighborhood that was finally free, he smiled quietly, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on a battlefield, but in the hearts of ordinary people determined to stand up for what is right. In the wake of Karen's public humiliation and the community's uprising, the local government quickly took notice. Within days, city officials announced a formal investigation into the practices of the now-defunct HOA. It became clear that the board's relentless overreach was not only unethical but illegal. A series of lawsuits were filed against the former HOA for enforcing non-existent rules and misappropriating funds, claims substantiated by Ethan's meticulous documentation and the testimonies of disillusioned residents. The investigation revealed that several board members, complicit in Karen's schemes, faced legal repercussions for their roles in the corruption. Fines were levied against the HOA, and new regulations were enacted to ensure that such abuses of power could never recur. In a climactic press conference, a city spokesperson declared, "The actions of the former HOA were a flagrant abuse of authority. Today, we restore the rights of every homeowner in this community, and those responsible for this injustice will be held accountable." Ethan, whose persistence had been instrumental in exposing the corruption, was invited to speak at the press conference. Standing before a room filled with reporters and community members, he delivered a measured but powerful address. "This isn't just about one person or one board," he said. "It's about reclaiming our neighborhoods and ensuring that every homeowner can enjoy their property without fear of arbitrary fines or intrusive inspections. Today, justice is served not only for me, but for all of us." The legal consequences extended beyond fines and resignations. The City Council voted to dissolve the old HOA structure entirely, replacing it with a more transparent, democratically elected community board. This reorganization was seen as a historic move, a decisive break from the past, and a step toward a future where every resident had a voice. For many in the community, the legal victory was both a relief and a moment of reckoning. It symbolized the triumph of truth over tyranny, and the assurance that no one was above the law. Ethan's final power move had set in motion a chain of events that not only punished the corrupt, but also fortified the community against future abuses. As the legal battles concluded and the community began to heal, Karen's personal life unraveled in tandem with her professional collapse. No longer shielded by her position of authority, she found herself isolated and ostracized. The financial penalties and public exposure took their toll. Her lavish lifestyle, once funded by misappropriated HOA funds, came crashing down. Late one afternoon, as she attempted to collect what little remained of her dignity, a call came through. Her car, a status symbol of her erstwhile power, was being repossessed. The humiliation deepened further when rumors of her improprieties reached even her closest circles. Her estranged husband, weary of the constant scandal and manipulation, filed for divorce, leaving her to confront the consequences of her actions alone. In a cruel twist of fate, Karen found herself forced into a role she had always despised, that of an assistant property manager for another HOA, a position that demanded humility and adherence to rules rather than the arbitrary exercise of power. At a local city hall meeting months later, as Karen attempted to defend herself in a final, feeble bid to regain some semblance of control, she was met with laughter and derision. "You once prided yourself on enforcing standards," a community member remarked, "but it seems you couldn't follow even the simplest rules yourself." The word stung, serving as a bitter reminder that her days of unchecked authority were over. For Ethan, witnessing Karen's personal downfall was a bittersweet reminder of poetic justice. He recalled the early days when he had simply wanted to protect his home, and now, in the wake of Karen's ruin, his home and community were finally at peace. Neighbors would later recount the irony. The very woman who had dedicated herself to policing others now found herself under the watchful scrutiny of a system that would not tolerate abuse. Karen's final public appearance, a brief, defeated moment at a neighborhood meeting where she tried to protest the new regulations, was enough to seal her fate. Her words, once so forceful and commanding, now came out in a whisper, lost amidst the murmurs of a community determined to move forward. The fall of Karen was not marked by dramatic gestures, but by the slow, inexorable collapse of a once imposing figure who had tried to bend everyone to her will. The neighborhood that had once trembled under the weight of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections now basked in a renewed sense of freedom and community spirit. In the months following Karen's departure, residents came together to rebuild, not just structures, but the bonds of trust and mutual respect that had been frayed by years of oppression. Ethan Carter, now celebrated as both a defender of individual rights and a catalyst for change, found solace in the simple pleasures of his reclaimed life. On quiet evenings, he would sit on his porch, its lights a beacon of security and a symbol of his hard-won victory, while neighbors strolled by, greeting him warmly. The atmosphere was lightened by shared laughter and the occasional playful teasing about past HOA antics. At the annual neighborhood picnic, an event that had once been marred by tension and hushed whispers, the mood was jubilant. A retired engineer joked as he handed Ethan a mock violation notice for having the best security system in town. "You've broken every rule of our old regime, except the one about keeping our hearts open," he quipped, eliciting a round of hearty laughter from the crowd. In that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the community gathered in celebration of their newfound unity, it was clear that the battle had been more than a personal victory for Ethan. It had sparked a transformation, a reclaiming of communal values that prioritized empathy, transparency, and justice over the cold, rigid dictates of an overzealous authority. Ethan's parting words at the picnic, delivered with a gentle smile, resonated deeply. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the end of a tyrant's rule, but the beginning of a community that truly cares for one another." His words, simple yet profound, underscored the lasting impact of standing up for one's rights. As laughter mingled with the soft strains of an acoustic guitar and the stars emerged overhead, the neighborhood embraced the future with open hearts. Even as a faded copy of an old HOA notice was playfully pinned to the community board, a relic of a darker time, the final mic drop was delivered without bitterness, only with the hope of a better tomorrow. And so, in the quiet aftermath of a turbulent battle, Ethan Carter's porch remained lit as a beacon of resilience, a reminder that when a community unites, even the most despotic forces can be overcome.